Moses. The Moses story, actually part 2. Now you remember that the outline of the entire Bible is found in 3 verses. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. That's when God says to Abraham, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to bless a nation, make a nation, and one day I'll bless all of the ethnics. I like to put it as a timeline this way, that it's very narrow here at a funnel, a little funnel we have here, and here's the first covenant with one man. Then it gets bigger as God makes a covenant with a nation, and then through Jesus there will be one that will become a worldwide or a global or a every ethnic covenant. So we have 3 stories: Abraham, Moses, Jesus. Abraham's story includes Joseph, and a nation is put together. They're in slavery. They're in the incubator, remember that? Where God protects them even though they're oppressed. They don't have to have an army. They don't have to raise taxes. They don't have to have government. They just have to reproduce and grow in number. When the time came for them to be delivered, Moses is called. He lives 40 years in Egypt. He knows the ways of Egypt. He spends 40 years in the wilderness. He learns the way of the wild country. And then he comes back to be of service, to bring people from Egypt to the homeland for the Jewish people. Now in Moses story 1, we talked about his interactions. Moses' work, his time spent dealing with Pharaoh. And finally the last of the 10 plagues came, which was the death of the firstborn of all who did not have the blood of the lamb on their doorposts. The Passover, an angel of the Lord, God, passing over the land, passing over the Hebrews. What a wonderful thing. They are spared. They go out to the Red Sea. They're traveling together, perhaps 1 million people. And they cross the Red Sea, and it's there that Pharaoh's army meets its doom. Now, Moses, part 2, is the journey. The journey from Egypt to the land of promise. Oh, I could tell you about the complaining. You know, why can't we go back? We want to go back. You know, at least back there we had a steady job. You know, the Hebrew people are complaining. Back there we had watermelons. Back there we had produce. Back there we had everything we wanted. Why can't we go back? And it seems like that's how they were. When you read Psalm 78, you're going to see this, where God blessed them and then they became disobedient. He blessed them, they became disobedient. And he was patient with them. Well, one of the things you need to have a nation is people. Another thing you need is law, and the third thing is land. Now, it's the Moses story part 2 really is about law. Because the Jewish people follow Moses. They get out into the wilderness. They come to Mount Sinai, which is still in politics today. It's a big thing, the Sinai Peninsula. They come to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up into Mount Sinai, and he spends time with God, and he comes back with these tablets, big tablets of stone, the 10 Commandments. And actually, what God gave the Jewish people was 613 laws. Now the 10 Commandments sort of capsulize it all. 4 of the commandments are about your relationship directly with God. 6 of the commandments are about your relationship with people. No adultery, no stealing, no false witness. And with God, no other gods before me, no graven images. But 613 laws. And if we wanted to look here through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you know, we can find those 613 laws. You know, some of them were, I guess we'd call them primitive. You know, if a child was incorrigible, couldn't be corrected, and the parents went to the leaders, and the leaders came and tried to work with that child, and the child was still could not be corrected, would not be corrected. They could stone that child to death. Adulterers were stoned to death. In fact, all 10 of the 10 commandments, when broken, were capital offenses. People were killed for this. But 613 laws. Now, you may remember that at the time of the Abraham covenant, God said, bring the animals, cut them in two, and God himself went through the parts. And if you have seen that video, you know that that was telling a story. God was saying, just as the Hittites did, that there's a oneness that happens because of the blood and the entrails of the animal. When you cut the animal in two, you are saying, this is how our relationship is. This is you, this is me. We're dead in the water. And so people would walk between the parts and the covenant would be made. And they would say, we're going to be one. Well, now the same thing happens in the book of Exodus. Same thing. God says, go get some bullocks, some young bulls. They cut the animals in two. They had a big vat where they put the blood from those animals and water. The people walked between, and that bloody water was sprinkled on them. And the words of Moses were this, you're now in the covenant. You are in the covenant. Now if you remember, a covenant has parties, terms, and promises. So let's say over here we have parties. God and Abraham. Leave your land, follow me, and I will bless you in all these ways. Now in the old covenant, we call it the law of Moses, God and the people of Israel. What are the terms? Obey 613 laws. What are the consequences? You're going to see this in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy 28 is what you might call the small print of the covenant. Deuteronomy 28, the first 14 verses say this, if you will hearken to the Lord, if you will do all that he says, then you will be blessed in the city, the country, your crops, your cattle, your children. I remember those 5 C's. City, country, crops, cattle, children. You'll be blessed. Verse 7 of Deuteronomy 28 says this, if your enemy comes against you and you've been obedient to me, if your enemy comes against you one way, I will scatter him 7 ways. Go ahead and read that. Deuteronomy 28, it says, you will be the head and not the tail. You will be the top and not the bottom. You will loan money to other nations, but you'll never have to borrow if you're faithful. You will be known everywhere as God's people. Then you begin with verse 15, Deuteronomy 28. But if you don't listen to me, if you don't hearken to me, if you don't obey my commands, see, these are the stipulations and the requirements. If you don't obey, then everything's reversed. Cursed in the city, cursed in the country, crops, cattle, children, you'll lose in battle, your children will be taken away from you, you'll wait for them, but they'll never be brought back. So the law of Moses was essentially, if you obey, the plus part of that, the blessing is physical blessings. Physical blessings. If you disobey, physical curses. And that went on for 1,500 years. So the Moses story, part 2, is really about getting the law, called the Law of Moses, 613 laws. And the relationship with God was built on compliance. You want to remember that. When you come to the New Testament, you see that our relationship is not just on compliance, there's something else. But in the Old Testament, it was being compliant. Can you see then how that would breed a sort of Pharisaical attitude? Because the Pharisees were all on compliance to the letter of the law. 1/10 of everything goes to God. That was one of the laws. So what did they become good at? 10 little seeds, 1 for God, 9 for me. Compliance, compliance, compliance. And of course there was sacrifice, and we're going to talk about that in a separate video. Moses and the Jewish people in fellowship when they are obedient, lack of fellowship when they were disobedient. And we'll talk about prophets as well as how they were compliance attorneys. We'll talk about that as we go along. This is the end of Moses 2.